This video is to begin questioning and practice questioning the status quo. I like to try and see as much of the world as possible through open eyes, seeing things for what they are instead of what I want them to be, what my ego wants them to be for its own protection, or through the lens of someone else. Now, in developing this skill, it's helpful to seek out assumptions in your life, then question how true they are. Sometimes it's difficult to find these assumptions since, by definition, an assumption is a thought that flies under the radar, exerting its influence mostly on the unconscious level. When you can find an assumption, I personally believe that it's always healthy to examine it. You may come to reject that assumption after careful examination, and in doing so, spur some personal growth. You may also examine it and say, that assumption is true, so nothing's different for me. Now, if that's the case, you've still grown as a person and as a thinker because you went through the exercise. I think this is an important exercise because I personally don't want to think someone else's thoughts. I want all my ideas to exist in my mind out of my own volition. I've noticed that the majority of people in this world are sleepwalking through their lives for one reason. They allow the thoughts of others to control their world. The main way entire populations are controlled is by a small group of individuals deciding on agendas, then inserting their thoughts into the minds of the masses via tools like propaganda, mass media, and early education programs. I never want to be considered one of these unthinking masses, and I don't want that for you either. So let's practice some critical thinking together today. Now, in this case, let's look at how valid is the assumption that humans are required to eat vegetables to be healthy. This is a very benign topic, the implications of which don't mean a whole lot in the big scheme of things, but I think the exercise is fun and important. So let's get into it. Now, my assertion here is this. I always assumed that vegetables were necessary to eat in order to be healthy, mostly because that's what I was always told since childhood. But I've never really liked the taste of vegetables, and it never seemed very logical to me that humans would be required to eat leaves to thrive. So upon an honest examination of this topic, I've actually come to a very different conclusion. The idea that humans need vegetables in order to be healthy is a complete myth. In fact, there are many more nutrient-dense food sources that actually taste good that we should be prioritizing before considering vegetable consumption. In the case of plant-based foods, these sources are fruits and tubers. Now, in this video, I will lay out my thought process for you to consider for yourself. After watching this, feel free to reject or accept this for yourself. Now, I understand that some people who will watch this have fewer brain cells than I have fingers on my right hand, so if critical thinking isn't for you, then you probably won't enjoy this video. Now, again, feel free to go watch something else. You always have a choice. Nobody's forcing you to watch this. So here's how this video will be laid out. First, the definition of a vegetable. It's important to define this. Second, the symbiotic relationship between fruits and humans. Third, I'm going to really look at fruits and tubers versus vegetables. Let's look at more details there. Fourth, I'm going to look at and examine quickly the observation that, children hate vegetables. I want to know why when we're born, we just hate vegetables. This is interesting. It's something that's worth looking at. And then fifth is the idea, because I know a lot of people will ask this question, aren't cruciferous vegetables good for controlling estrogen and increasing testosterone? I think that's a good question. I think it's relevant to this channel specifically because I focus so much on hormonal health. All right, so first off, we're going to look at what is a vegetable. Now, the working definition of what constitutes a vegetable has actually been strangely controversial. However, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to define the plants that we'll be discussing here, the fruits, the vegetables, and the tubers, in the following most widely agreed upon way. This should clear up any confusion that people have. It may not, but here we go. This is how we're going to define things. A vegetable constitutes the stems and the leaves. For example, celery and broccoli would be considered stems. Kale, spinach, and lettuce are considered leaves. That is what a vegetable is. This is actually a widely accepted definition, and that's what the definition we're going to use here in this video. The stems and the leaves of the plant is the vegetable. A fruit contains seeds or can act as a seed, and it's the structure that develops from the ovaries of a flowering plant. For example, apples, peaches, grapes, etc. These are all the common ones that people they consider a fruit. One common misconception is that fruits are only sweet. There are actually plenty of savory fruits. For example, eggplant, tomatoes, zucchinis, avocados, olives, squash, and bell peppers are all fruits, but they're savory. Now, tubers are the third thing that we're going to define here. Tubers are roots. They're so dense in nutrients that they literally sprout and sustain their own plants if they're left unharvested. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, carrots, turnips, and beets all fall into this category. So as you can see, most of what the average person would consider a vegetable is actually not a vegetable. And all the ones that most people would agree tasted any good are not vegetables. They're fruits and tubers. I'll go more into why I think this is the case here in a minute. So now let's talk about the symbiotic relationship between fruits and humans. So one thing that struck me as interesting is to just take a step back and simply examine the facts about the differences between how fruits, vegetables, and tubers grow, and what this might tell us about their specific value or purpose in their evolutionary role with humans. It would appear, after a basic examination of the facts, that fruits are meant to be eaten. Here's what I mean by that. First off, they're jam-packed with nutrients, and if someone was to eat even a small range of different fruits regularly, they would fulfill most, if not all, of their dietary micronutrient needs. Another thing that's interesting is the fact that they have fast ripening cycles. They go through these fast-growing and ripening cycles, and all of them contain seeds, where most of the seeds / the pits are hard and inedible for humans, and these seeds regrow the trees, bushes, or vines after consumption. Even if the human or animal that ate the fruit just drops it on the ground haphazardly, it'll regrow itself. This is a really convincing and quite a genius pollination technique that ensures the long-term survival of these fruit plants and these fruits, but also their relationship with animals and people that will eat them and spread their seed for them afterward. It's a symbiotic relationship. Now, vegetables, on the other hand, are not this way. They require more careful cultivation if they're to be, cultivated for consumption, and they release actually small amounts of bitter toxins as a defense mechanism against being eaten by animals or insects. Quite the opposite of fruits. Vegetables have developed these defense mechanisms, these systems, specifically to not be eaten by insects or other animals. While the leaves and the stems of certain plants do contain nutrients, they're not necessarily the best sources of those nutrients for humans to consume. They contain almost 0 calories, which evolutionarily speaking is a downside, and the human stomach doesn't have much of a capacity for massive leaf and stem consumption due to the high load of fiber. Whereas other species of mammals have developed stomach systems like that of the grazing cows that are actually meant to be able to handle massive amount of all day long consumption of these grasses, stems, and leaves. It simply doesn't make any evolutionary sense for a human to need to consume the leaves or stems of certain plants in order to be healthy. That makes absolutely no sense. The low caloric density coupled with high fiber and non-exclusive nutrients all point to the reasonable conclusion that humans do not need to consume vegetables. They are likely, in fact, more of a luxury in today's modern world, but most definitely not necessary. Now let's consider tubers. So tubers are literally roots that are so nutritious that they will sprout their own plants, and they will feed those plants with their nutrients. So tubers also generally have a very appealing taste to humans and other animals. The starchy carbohydrates are easily digested and also contain prebiotic fiber, which is great for human intestinal flora. All right, so fruits, tubers, and vegetables. Let's consider what we just talked about. And considering that, I can pretty confidently conclude that vegetables, while they may be nutritious, aren't actually necessary to be healthy. If you're consuming the arguably more nutrient and energy-dense fruits and tubers. Now, I say this mostly because I know a lot of people who hate vegetables, yet they carry around some kind of ridiculous guilt about not eating them regularly. This guilt is not necessary. You can be extremely healthy by getting your nutrients from fruits and tubers, and you'll live to a ripe old age without ever eating a bitter leaf of kale again. In fact, since we're on the topic of kale, I'd like to point something out to you. Kale is a fad. It's not fit for human consumption, yet people have been wildly swindled into thinking that it's healthy. In fact, the kale fad has done more harm than good, and in such an underhanded way that most people don't even realize it's the kale that's giving them issues. Why? Well, let's examine some facts about kale. Kale, far before being widely consumed by sheeple, was actually consumed by real sheep, the kind that graze around in a field. Farmers were feeding kale to their sheep as an alternate food source, Yet they started to realize that the lambs that were being born with goiter, or basically swollen, poorly functioning thyroid gland, they started to see that that was a bit suspicious. So researchers experimented with the kale on the sheep and rabbits with pretty disturbing results. Turns out kale contains a goitrogen called thiocyanate, which is chemically very similar to the deadly cyanide. Some young lambs were stillborn and their brain development stunted by their goiters. The consumption of the kale had actually blocked their thyroid's ability to function properly, even in the presence of proper iodine consumption. And with many modern people consuming very little iodine, it's no wonder that the instances of hypothyroidism are rising every year. Meanwhile, kale is being turned into every type of junk food imaginable, from poofa fried kale chips to kale shakes. This anti-thyroid leafy vegetable is going to do some real damage if it's not exposed, so I'm going to do my part. I've never liked kale. I think it's just people are just convincing themselves they like it. It doesn't even taste good. Scientists, when they first started studying kale, never considered that humans would someday actually consider it a health food. Back then, it was only food for livestock. At that point, it wasn't even an impressive food because it was actually, damaging the health of this livestock, and a lot of the livestock, wasn't even being born. They were being born with developmental issues. So even before people, were noshing on kale chips all day, kale managed to poison these cows and anyone who was eating it. So cows grazing on kale transferred the poisons from the kale into the milk, which happens very frequently, a lot of times with estrogens, but it can be transferred with these goitrogens as well, affecting the thyroid development of the children that were drinking this milk and causing even a well-documented epidemic of goiter in Tasmania. So we're not talking just the US here. There was actually a widespread epidemic of goiter because of the livestock. The cows that were giving the milk in Tasmania actually had all of this in their system. Kale is also rich in sulfur and compounds that convert to sulfur, which is the chemical that basically makes eggs smell bad. One metabolite of sulfur, which is called S-methylcysteine sulfoxide, is known to cause, quote, what's known as kale poisoning, which is severe hemolytic anemia, which is a life-threatening breakdown of red blood cells in livestock. Poor sulfur digestion is associated with many serious illnesses in humans, though whether it causes them or merely exacerbates them remains to be seen. So it makes sense that kale would be dangerous given it's evolved in an evolutionary war basically against those that try and eat it. Like I was saying earlier, these leaves have actually evolved into having these defense mechanisms against being eaten, and kale is just one of the examples. And my point in using kale as an example isn't really to scare anybody. It's merely to just point out that the evolutionary role of leaves is not as benign as you might have first considered. Since leaves are constantly exposed to potential predators, the plants develop really effective chemical defense mechanisms against being eaten. So wouldn't it make more sense to eat something nutritious that will actually make you healthier and needs you to eat it, like fruit? All right, let's talk about the observation about why do children hate vegetables. Now, I'm sure that a lot of people are just going to brush this off as not a serious consideration. However, it is something that we should consider. If we continue to look at the evolutionary importance of human relationships with food sources, the fact that pretty much all children hate vegetables with no prior preconditioning to them is really interesting. You would think that if something was essential for human health, then why would human children widely despise it so much? And why would we force our kids to eat something like leaves? That doesn't make much sense. If you ask yourself this question, the honest answer is that we tell our kids to eat vegetables because that's what our parents told us. And that's not a reasonable argument. Children also have peak health. They have boundless energy, imagination, and clear skin, and oftentimes perfect eyesight. It's only after years of eating poorly and subjecting ourselves to stress and consuming things that I call blockers, things that are getting in the way of the health, that we degrade our once perfect health into a state of disease and dysfunction. I think this is a fascinating observation, and the fact that kids hate vegetables is not one to be brushed off lightly. All right, last but not least, aren't cruciferous vegetables good for controlling estrogen and increasing testosterone? Yes, actually, it's pretty well known that IC3 and DIM, which are compounds found in cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, they are useful for controlling estrogen. However, you can extract these things. You can get these things as extracts to get these specific compounds from the broccoli in a much higher potency. You actually need to use them as extracts to actually get an effective dose of them, so you can get it, in a concentrated amount without actually having to eat the broccoli. The amount of broccoli you would need to eat to get an effective dose of these compounds would be insanely high. So if you would want these compounds, I just recommend getting an extract anyways. So all this being said, hopefully you got some valuable information from this video. If you'd like to see me go into more detail like with these videos on this channel and do these bigger topics, just subscribe to this channel, like the video, and let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching and for considering something new.